The Quintaglio Ascension Trilogy is a series of books that revolve around a sentient race of tyrannosaurs that explore and uncover the many secrets of their world. What they end up discovering makes them question everything they thought they already knew about their planet, their universe, and their very existence. Written by Canadian science fiction author Robert J. Sawyer, the series includes the book Far-Seer, written in 1992, Fossil Hunter, written in 1993, and Foreigner, written in 1994. And today, I want to go through and analyze each of these stories. Before we get started, I do want to mention that this wasn't something that I stumbled upon on my own. It was actually suggested to me by someone who had commented about it in one of the posts I made on my community tab that I ended up deleting. And I didn't get the name of the person before I deleted that post. I am sorry about that, but I do want to thank that person for suggesting this to me, because this ended up being a much better read than I initially anticipated. And because of that, I not only want to share it with you, but also recommend it. I do want to give a fair warning now that I'm going to spoil a lot from this book. Obviously, I can't cover every single detail of the story due to how much of it there is. So if you haven't read it yet and you're interested in it, I suggest that you just leave now to read it and then come back to the video later. You can find the digital version of the trilogy on Amazon Kindle and the audiobooks of them on Audible, which is how I ended up reading these books. There are other places to get hard copy versions of it as well, and I'll make sure to link all of that in the description down below for you guys. Seriously, this book is best if you just experience it for yourself. You've been warned. As mentioned earlier, the Quintaglio Ascension Trilogy was written by Robert J. Sawyer, a Canadian author known for his works in science fiction and mystery fiction. Even from an early age, Sawyer had developed a strong fascination with books, both fictional and non-fictional, giving him a sense of appreciation in the stories that delve deep into the world of science and explaining how the world worked. This would also lead him to develop a great interest in dinosaurs, which made him realize that, unlike other monsters from myths and legends, dinosaurs were real at one point. Not only were they the closest examples to real-life monsters, but there was also so little known about them, which shows a lot of potential to the imagination. This strong interest in dinosaurs would stick with him until he reached adulthood. There was even a point where Sawyer thought he'd be a paleontologist, but opted to be a writer instead after finding out his future in paleontology may not provide him the stability he wanted in his life. He would begin this career as a freelance writer, dabbling in journalism and even writing some short stories throughout the 80s. It wasn't until 1989 when he decided that he had enough to take a year off to write his first novel. This novel would be known as Golden Fleece, and it wouldn't do that well in terms of sales despite generating positive reviews. It wouldn't be until he wrote his second novel, Far-Seer, where things would change for Sawyer. Not only would it perform well, but it also sold well, and from here Sawyer would become a full-time writer, and would eventually write a total of 25 novels and countless short stories, which have garnered him praise and awards. His books are known to often dive deep into the relationship of science and religion, exploring their connections together in some areas and pitting them against each other in other areas. As far as the Quintaglio Ascension Trilogy itself, it wasn't actually meant to be a trilogy, according to Sawyer. Apparently, he had every intention of just writing one book, that book being Far-Seer, and leaving it there as a standalone novel, since he actually didn't like making series at all. After his agent read the book, he pressured Sawyer to turn it into a series, as something like this deserved much more than just a single book. Sawyer was reluctant to do it at first, but decided to do so, also including that he would make no more than 3 books, and would see to it that the series would get a conclusive ending to it by the 3rd one. He also wanted each book to be their own, having no cliffhangers leading to the next one in the series. Despite seeming hesitant about it in the beginning, he even admits that he was glad his agent was insistent on making this into a series. But despite Far-Seer being the first book of the Quintaglio Ascension Trilogy, this didn't actually mark the first time a Quintaglio had appeared in Sawyer's work. Quintaglios are what the sentient tyrannosaurs refer to themselves as, and their first appearance was actually in a 1987 short story that Sawyer also wrote called Uphill Climb. While there isn't a lot of information about the short itself around the web, it was compiled into an anthology book that contains several of Sawyer's other short stories, which is called Iterations. That's actually how I ended up being able to read this short story. But even for a short story, it was a lot shorter than I thought, only being a few pages long. But it centers around a pair of Quintaglios living in the far future where they've invented robots that run on treads. These robots take on different tasks like retrieving objects, running errands, and even looking after infants. Basically, the conflict is that one Quintaglio wants to improve the robot's design to give it better locomotion, especially for climbing over obstacles like stairs rather than having it have to rely on ramps, hence the name of the short uphill climb, while the other Quintaglio is thinking more about making money by selling the robots as they are, rather than spending more money to improve them. Again, not much to this story, but it does showcase the advancements the Quintaglios had made in technology, and the short as a whole serves as a precursor to this eventual trilogy. And that's pretty much it in regards to what this book series is and how it came to be. However, there is still one more thing I want to cover before we get into the actual books, and that's the overall lore behind the Quintaglios. Now, I say one more thing as if we're going to briefly touch on it, but in all actuality, there's a lot about the Quintaglios that we need to cover. Because in just these 3 books, Sawyer establishes so much about these creatures and their culture, lifestyle, history, beliefs, and their overall world. So I'm going to run through all of the more important aspects and information about the Quintaglio race, that way you aren't confused as I'm explaining certain parts of the story where these pieces of information are needed. There's a lot of information that will surely spoil more about the book, so once again, if you haven't read the book and you're interested in it, now's the time to leave. Otherwise, let's get into it. The Quintaglios, as described earlier, are an intelligent race of dinosaurs that were specifically descended from Nanotyrannus. Despite their sentience, they still hold a lot of physical and behavioral similarities to their ancestors. At least the early 90s depiction of their ancestors, which a lot of tyrannosaurs were still given more of a reptilian look during this period in pop culture. So basing the Quintaglios off of that gave us a descendant with some reptile-like features. But just like their ancestors, they still eat meat and hunt their own food, they have a mouthful of teeth, they have forward-facing eyes, they have a strong and robust body and tail, they still stand bipedally on feet that have 3 toes and claws, and they have a dewlap. At least the males do, since Quintaglios also possess some level of sexual dimorphism. But again, these are advanced versions of tyrannosaurs that have had 65 million years to evolve the way they are. As a result of this, they do have some obvious differences between themselves and their ancestors. Of course, the biggest difference is their intelligence. Unlike their ancestors, Quintaglios are able to speak, write, use tools, they have a concept of religion and civility, they are able to build structures and establish societies, they can domesticate animals and sail ships, and so on and so forth. Despite their intelligence and civility though, they do have a savage side to them. Quintaglios have their own individual territories that others cannot step within, because if they do, it sends the one whose space had been violated into Dagamant, which is a word in the Quintaglios language that's used to describe a sort of battle frenzy that they are unable to control. Dagamant seems to be triggered by instinct when one space is violated, and this sends the Quintaglio into a violent spree that takes an indefinite amount of time to come out of. Because of this, Quintaglios are unable to physically touch each other or really be near each other because of their limitations of territoriality. The socially acceptable distance they should be from each other ranges from 7 to 10 paces, which means they've been practicing social distancing well before our time. Sometimes there are ways that they can suppress this feeling quicker or suppress it before it even starts by taking their aggression out on prey. The only times Quintaglios are able to touch each other without triggering Dagamant is during mating season when females are receptive to males. There are also times when you can be within a Quintaglio's territory only if they give you permission to do so, or if you give them warning that you are close. However, there are points where being too close for even too long can set off Dagamant, and when it does, it can also cause others to go into Dagamant, which can lead to an absolute bloodbath if there is a crowd. Then of course we have the more physical differences. One of the more noticeable physical differences is their overall body size. Nanotyrannuses are said to reach heights of 6.5 feet, but the oldest Quintaglios can get up to a total of 8 feet in height. Along with that, instead of having short arms with 2 fingers, they instead have extended arms with 5 fingers. They also retain their claws, however they also develop the ability to retract them when they aren't needed. In regards to their posture, they stand semi-upright, horizontal enough to still rely on their tails for balance, but vertical enough for there to be a noticeable difference. The only times their back is fully horizontal is when they're in a running position. Then of course there are all of the very unique reptile-like features that they managed to develop during their evolutionary history. Quintaglios have the ability to regenerate their limbs, tails, and even even flesh around their body save for things like organs. They also have vibrant green skin with only one area, that being the snout, being able to change to another color, that color being blue. This is referred to as the liar's tint, which is very literal in its meaning because if a Quintaglio tells a lie, their muzzle will turn to a blue color. As far as their textures go, they have more of a leathery hide rather than a scaly one since they lost most of their scales over millions of years of evolution. And finally, we have some of their external qualities. As far as clothing or accessories, Quintaglios don't actually wear that much. Most, if not all of the time, they will be wearing very simple things like sashes and jewelry and belts. The only fully clothed Quintaglios are the priests who wear robes of varying colors depending on their rank and region. And speaking of priests, there's also the religion that the Quintaglios heavily follow, especially in the first book. As mentioned earlier, Sawyer does tend to incorporate the themes of religion and science within his books, and this trilogy are some of those very books. According to the book, a lot of the Quintaglios believe that they were created by their Quintaglio goddess that they simply referred to as God throughout the entire series. This goddess began the creation of life through a process called the 8 eggs of creation. Through each of these eggs which she laid came the existence of various aspects of the world the Quintaglios live on. The first egg contained all of the planet's water. The second egg contained the land. Third had all of the air. Fourth had the sun. Fifth had pretty much all of space. Sixth had all of the vegetation. Seventh contained all of the herbivorous animals. And the eighth one contained all of the carnivorous animals. But even after all of this, she still wasn't satisfied. God wanted something else that could think more intricately, something that would pray to her. Eventually, she would create the first 5 Quintaglios from her own flesh and blood, and she did so by biting and severing her left arm so that it could fall onto the world, specifically on a continent that would simply be called land. And when it did, each finger detached from the hand of her severed arm and formed into what will become known to the Quintaglio race as the 5 original hunters. These 5 hunters were named Lubal, Mecht, Katoon, Hug, and Belbar. However, despite being alive, the hunters were not satisfied and prayed to God to let them create on their own as well, which greatly angered her. But she would eventually come around to the idea of giving them the ability to create life on their own, but only jointly with other Quintaglios. So she severed her right arm to fall onto land so that 5 more Quintaglios were created from the detached fingers of her right hand. This time they were males and not hunters. Their names were Varkev, Dargo, Katud, Jozark, and Datoon. These 5 males and 5 females would eventually mate with each other, each pair producing a clutch of 8 eggs, much to God's dismay. She didn't want land to be overrun by Quintaglios, so to remedy this, she had Mecht devour 7 of the 8 overall babies in each clutch so that 5 total would be allowed to live. The devouring of the 7 out of 8 baby Quintaglios would soon be known as the culling of the Blood Priest. Because Mecht was assigned to essentially control the population of the Quintaglios, this would make her the first Blood Priest. And the position of the Blood Priest is a very present thing in the Quintaglios' modern world. But it has more so to do with the necessity of keeping up with population control rather than it being a traditional thing that was commanded by God. We'll get more into the importance of this later, but as for the rest of the story of the 5 original hunters, they would eventually start declaring pieces of land as their own as to establish territories to separate one another, another thing that made God very angry. While the original 5 hunters are seen as important figures in the Sacred Scrolls, which is like the Bible for the Quintaglios, the 2 most important ones to know for the story are Mecht and Lubal. During a hunt that was being led by Lubal, she ended up getting impaled by a wild ceratopsian dinosaur. And as she was dying, her last words were the mentions of a great hunter that she simply called the One, who would be a male and would lead the Quintaglios on the greatest hunt of all time, and that the rest of the population should heed his warnings, whatever they may be. She would die shortly after this message, and the Quintaglios who heard about this story would see Lubal as a prophet who was trying to warn them about something that would take place in the far future. The book implies that the original 5 hunters as a whole were at one point worshipped, but this would eventually change due to a certain event that took place about 150 years before the overall story of the first book. This event was when a Quintaglio prophet called Larsk went on a voyage and stumbled upon a very important discovery. a strange orb-like entity in the sky that he interpreted as the face of God, or at least what he believed to be the face of God. A discovery like this would give Larsk some level of divine authority, and that would eventually manifest into full-on divine powers to his lineage. His descendants would be known as the royal family, who would go on to rule all of land. And as a way to celebrate Larsk's discovery, a tradition was created so that when Quintaglios reach a certain age, they descend on the same voyage that Larsk went on and see the face of God for themselves. And this journey serves as a rite of passage for young Quintaglios. Oh yeah, another part of this story is that the Quintaglios apparently believe their world is essentially a massive body of land that's floating down an even more massive river that orbits around the face of God. However, there's a cult known as the Lubalites that actually don't believe the orb in the sky is actually God, since the original story suggests that God was actually a female Quintaglio, and because of this, they instead worship the original 5 hunters and their story based around the creation of life. At least that's my understanding of the lore. I won't lie, it did get a little confusing for me to follow, but I think for the most part, this is how things went. So there was a point when Quintaglios were freely able to worship the original 5 hunters, but after they refused to believe the face of God was actually God, Larsk forbade the worship of the original 5 to the point where Quintaglios could actually face punishment if they did. Eventually though, through the events of the first book, things would change for that once again, but we'll get to that later. Anyways, that's pretty much the gist of their religion. Next, there's also certain aspects about the continent the Quintaglios live on that should be known as well. As mentioned earlier, this continent that they inhabit is literally just called land. Land is split into different provinces called Argtalar, Chutalar, Edstalar, Fratalar, Jamtalar, Kevtalar, Martalar, and the capital city. Whether these provinces somehow originated from the original 5 hunters' established territories, I don't really know. But these are the provinces and territories that are used in the main story of the books. Anyways, within each province there are different Quintaglio groups and tribes kind of doing their own things, but are still ruled over by the emperor or the empress of the royal family. The book mainly takes place in the capital though, where the royal family themselves live, and is where the bases of operations take place for the entirety of land. And the way everything is structured within their society, it's supposed to mimic a pre-industrialized age, one that's more akin to the Renaissance or the Age of Enlightenment time periods. The Quintaglios are advanced, but they haven't really mastered certain technological feats yet. There's no electricity or technology or any of that kind of stuff, but you'll be able to pick up on the things that they have managed to build and accomplish as we go through the story. Land often falls victim to landquakes, especially the capital since it's positioned close to the Chamar volcanoes. Because of the landquakes that have only gotten more frequent as the years go by, they often have to rebuild a lot of their buildings and structures, which are primarily made out of stone. And it's kind of strange how they're able to build these structures, yet they're also described to be a nomadic group that follows where the food source is. But that's not something that's touched upon a lot in this series. And speaking of the Quintaglios, they are not the only dinosaurs to inhabit this continent, or even their entire planet for that matter. While the Quintaglios are the only intelligent dinosaurs in the world, aside from the others who we will meet in the 3rd book, there are wild dinosaurs roaming around as well. But the Quintaglios obviously don't refer to these dinosaurs by their actual names, but rather have their own names for them. Shovelmouths are hadrosaurs, thunder beasts are sauropods, horn faces is the general term for ceratopsids, spike frills are specifically referring to styracosaurs, armorbacks are ankylosaurs, running beasts are ornithomimids, terror claws are dromaeosaurs, wing fingers are pterosaurs, black deaths are specifically referring to tyrannosauruses, water serpents are plesiosaurs, and fish lizards are ichthyosaurs. And there are other forms of wildlife, but I'll talk about those when we get through the book. And finally, there's also the average life of a Quintaglio that you should know about. As we already established, female Quintaglios lay a clutch of 8 eggs, but through the process of the culling, only 1 out of the 8 are allowed to live. When they do, they are pretty much raised by the tribe in general rather than them having specific parents. Think of it as a mandatory orphanage, where the mothers essentially give up their children to the creche, or in other terms, the nursery. And because of how their culture is, the Quintaglio parents don't have the same kind of attachment to their kids as humans would to their own. To them, this is just the way of life, and they have no real qualms with it. So their children grow up with the tribe, and the rest function similarly to our own lifestyle. The kids go through schooling and eventually choose the thing that interests them the most to focus on. Along with this, as they reach their young adult years, they also need to perform a couple of traditional customs that serve as a rite of passage for them, which also earns them a spot in heaven according to the sacred scrolls, which are basically the Quintaglios' version of the Bible. And while we're on the topic of the aging of Quintaglios, time is measured differently in their society. The vocabulary they have for specific time frames are decadays, which is 10 days, kiladays, which is 1,000 days, and a whole year for them is 18,000 days instead of the 365 that we're used to. So when they refer to themselves as a certain age, like say one of the Quintaglios say they are 16 kiladays old, they aren't necessarily saying they are 16 years old, they are saying that they are 16,000 days old. Anyways, when they get older, they find work through different means to contribute to the Quintaglio society. As far as mating seasons go, females only go into an estrus cycle once every 1 year. And keep in mind, 1 year in their world is 18,000 days. So in her entire lifetime, a female Quintaglio will only mate at most about 4 times. However, it can differ depending on the situation. Sometimes females mate earlier than the cycle and again during the cycle. And the females typically seek out their mates by instinct and will mate with different males as there are no established relationships. But that doesn't exclude the chances of a pair bond relationship between some Quintaglios. And from there, the process starts all over, with the female laying her clutch of 8 eggs sometime after the cycle and handing the responsibilities of those eggs to the creche nest. Alright, I know that was a lot of information, but for now that's pretty much the majority there is on the Quintaglios, save for some of the minor things that I didn't mention because it is either not that important or it will just come up later anyways. Regardless, you pretty much have all of the information needed to understand the story, so without keeping you waiting for too much longer, let's get into the first book of the Quintaglio Ascension Trilogy, Far-Seer. In this first book, we're focused on aspiring astrologer Afsan, a curious young and naive male Quintaglio who serves as the Saurian version of Galileo. The Quintaglio Ascension Trilogy is a very allegorical series that mirrors specific important figures and discoveries made in our own world, and the events throughout the trilogy represent the very age of enlightenment that we humans went through. So in Far-Seer, we follow Afsan on his journey around the world he lives in, where he discovers many of its truths. Afsan was originally from the Arj Talar province, more specifically from his hometown called Pakkarno. Due to Afsan's intelligence and passion for astrology, it landed him an opportunity to transfer to Capital City to study under court astrologer Toxalid. Toxalid is a much older Quintaglio who is very strict and set in his ways, but also serves as one of the many guides to Afsan. The story begins with Afsan on his way to Salid's office where he sees him arguing with Valkanir, a tailless mariner who was there to try to talk Salid into using a new invention for his studies in astrology. This new invention is a tool made of brass metal and glass lenses and is used as a way to see objects in a closer, more detailed perspective. In our world, we call this a telescope, but in their world, it's referred to as a Far-Seer. Salid refuses and Kinnear sees himself out, but before he does, he mentions that he's scheduled to set sail on his ship, which is called the Dashater, in a number of days for a pilgrimage. And until then, if Salid changes his mind about the new invention, he knows where to find him. Unlike Salid, this new invention intrigues Afsan, and he even brings up the idea of using it to see the face of God, which angers and offends Salid as he considers this to be blasphemy against their god. So he sends Afsan away to pray for forgiveness. When Afsan arrives to the house of worship, he runs into the high priest and master of the faith, Det Yanalb, who asks if Afsan plans to go on the pilgrimage to see the face of God that all young Quintaglios are required to do at least once in their lives as a part of the Quintaglio tradition. Knowing that the Dashater is leaving in a matter of days, Afsan sees this as a good opportunity to complete this rite of passage. But Yanalb also tells tells Afsan that he should consider doing his first hunt. The first hunt is another tradition that young Quintaglios typically undergo, and they earn a hunting tattoo after, showing that they survived and completed the experience. It's highly recommended that Quintaglios complete their first hunt and earn their tattoo because it essentially secures them a spot in heaven. And because not everyone survives the pilgrimage, it would be a shame if Afsan was one of the Quintaglios that died during the voyage without a hunting tattoo. So Afsan decides to do exactly that, but to avoid being waitlisted, he tries to find his old friend Prince Daibo, who's the son of the Empress who rules all of land. Surely with Daibo's royal status and his own association with him, they'll be able to complete these requirements in no time. However, there was a matter of convincing Daibo. Despite being the prince, he's still required to undergo these traditions, which he hasn't done yet. Also, Daibo is on the heavier side since he lives a life of luxury being the son of the Empress and all. So he's not the most physically fit for these things. Like, Afsan tries to look for him to propose the idea to him and literally finds him in the cafeteria eating a bunch of food being served to him by the butcher Pal Kadul, another character who will be more prominent as the story continues. Anyways, after some convincing from both Afsan and even Kadul, Daibo eventually agrees to join him on the hunt and voyage. The following day, Afsan is summoned by the Empress herself, whose name is Len Lens, who immediately suspects Afsan of using Daibo for his status for his own reasons. Despite this, she allows Daibo to go with Afsan on the hunt and the voyage, but makes it very clear that Afsan is responsible for Daibo's safe return, and if he doesn't, he will face serious punishment. With this, Afsan and Daibo, along with a few other Quintaglios, go on their first hunt somewhere outside of the capital, which is led by an older female Quintaglio named Jaltedex. It doesn't seem like there's a specific type of dinosaur the Quintaglios go after during this hunt. It seems more based around whatever is in the area. And of course, the first hunt that Afsan and Daibo go on, it's not something simple like a shovel mouth. Nope, their first hunt is a thunder beast. And not just any thunder beast, but according to the book, the biggest thunder beast the Quintaglios had ever seen. And these amateur hunters are expected to take it down. What starts off as a coordinated hunt turns into a messy effort in trying to take down this massive sauropod. They try to jump on it and rip through its thick skin to expose flesh, and they try to take it out by its legs. But instead, they're greeted with being nearly stomped on and being tossed around like nothing. But then Afsan comes to his senses, jumps on the thunder beast, and begins to climb up its very long neck until he gets close to the head, where he then proceeds to bite and rip through the tender parts of the dinosaur's throat, which is enough to take it down. As the large animal topples to the ground, Afsan jumps away at the last minute to avoid being crushed by the thunder beast, but also has a very rough landing that knocks him out. When he awakes, he's being treated by a doctor and finds out that he's being praised for taking down the large thunder beast. No one had ever heard of a Quintaglio being able to take down an animal as big as a thunder beast on their first hunt, let alone the way Afsan did it. Because of this, the once forgettable Afsan had garnered the respect of pretty much everyone. After giving himself a little bit of time to heal, he and Daibo eventually go to set sail on the Dasher for the pilgrimage. And as mentioned earlier, the way the pilgrimages work is that the ships will set sail on course to where the face of God is, and once they reach to a point where they are directly under the face, they will stay there for a certain amount of days to pray and worship it. Then they turn around and make their way back home. But things don't go exactly as planned this time around. For Afsan, all he wants to do is find Quintaglios and ask him to see the Far-Seer device, despite how Salid felt about it. Quintaglios is more than willing to let him use it, and when Afsan finally gets a hold of the Far-Seer, he uses it to look at the stars, the planets, and even the face of God itself as soon as it becomes visible to the passengers on the ship. After weeks of doing this, Afsan makes one of his first big discoveries. Because he's able to look at the planets in such great detail with the Far-Seer, he comes to the realization that they look very similar to the face of God. With this, he concludes that the face of God, an orb in the sky that all Quintaglios had been taught to worship, is nothing more than a planet. He also comes to another realization. Not only was he able to observe the planets, but he was also able to observe their moons as well. Which for all of these planets featured within the book, each one of them have several moons that orbit at different ranges and speeds. After making these observations, Afsan is convinced that the object they are living on is one of the moons that orbit the planet that was initially thought to be the face of God. And this changes the initial belief that the world is just a piece of land on a giant river. Because if their world is a moon, then that means it's round, and if they left from the east end of their home continent, then all they would have to do is keep sailing straight towards east, and they will eventually reach the west end of their home continent. Afsan wants to put this to the test, and attempts to convince Quintaglios to keep the ship going towards the east so that they can be sure. At this point of the story, they've well reached the face of God and have started their process of praying and worshipping under it. The plan from here is to turn the ship around and head towards the west back home instead of going towards the east, since no one's ever traveled through the waters that lie beyond the face of God. And it's because of this Quintaglios refuses to honor Afsan's wishes, since sailing in uncharted waters could be dangerous. And guess what happens next? One of the crew members spots a giant water serpent that's known to Quintaglios as Quintaglios. Quintaglios has a bit of a personal vendetta against this creature, since it's the reason why Quintaglios doesn't have a tail, even though it'll just grow back anyways. Cal, the water serpent, is heading towards the east, well past the face of God. And because Quintaglios holds so much anger towards this creature, he decides to derail the entire pilgrimage and set his direct focus on the water serpent. Despite making it very clear that the uncharted waters beyond the face of God are dangerous, he decides to make this trip anyways. For weeks, they chase Cal towards the east, and finally the serpent decides to attack the Dashater, coming close enough to snap up several crew members in its jaws. Quintaglios and several other of his crewmates take this opportunity to jump on and attack the serpent, but Cal soon retreats back into the water, taking Quintaglios and the others down with it. Cal does eventually surface again, where Afsan takes charge and uses the rope from the anchor to swing around Cal's neck and has the anchor dropped into the sea, which strangles and kills the serpent. Luckily, Quintaglios and the rest of the Quintaglios made it safely back onto the boat. But now, since Quintaglios is in Afsan's debt for saving him, he honors his wishes to continue traveling east. During the rest of the voyage, Afsan takes this time to fill Daibo in on everything that he's found out, much to Daibo's amazement. As this is happening, one of the crew members succumbs to Dagomant and attacks Daibo, but Afsan interferes to ensure Daibo doesn't get hurt. In the process, this ends up triggering Dagomant into him as well, and this causes Afsan to kill the crew member and almost go after Daibo as well, but he managed to snap out of it before that could happen. So one of the things that I didn't mention in the beginning is how Dagomant is looked at in Quintaglio culture. Quintaglios seem fully aware that anyone that succumbs to Dagomant isn't really themselves, and it's just part of their nature, so when a kill to a Quintaglio is made by another one who's in the middle of this violent trance, they aren't seen as murderers and vice versa. When a Quintaglio is affected by Dagomant and attacks another one, the one that's being attacked has every right to defend themselves. And you might be thinking, if the Quintaglios know about their Dagomant situation, why would they take the unnecessary risk of traveling with several more of them on a boat? Well, all structures are built to accommodate for this, with ships being built big enough to hold enough rooms for each individual to get their own, and enough space on deck for them to be able to spread out. Other structures and areas have wide hallways and streets that are built to avoid causing large crowds. But sometimes there will be one-off situations such as this one that happens to Quintaglios that may have been on the ship for too long. In this case with Afsan and the other crewmates, it's clear that Afsan had no choice. After several days go by, the Dashater successfully completes its global course, as the site of the western parts of land can be seen, meaning Afsan was correct in his assumption of the world being round. Once the Dashater reaches close enough to land, they decide to stop for a few days so that everyone on board can run around, hunt prey, and eat fresh food. During all of this, Daibo and Afsan learn through a pack of Quintaglios passing by the area that Empress Len Lens, Daibo's mother, had died during a landquake. Because of this, Daibo is now seen as the new emperor of land and is needed at the capital as soon as possible. However, because they are still in the western part of land, they're still days away from actually reaching the capital, and the Dacitor is unable to take him since it wouldn't be ready for another few days. So Daibo decides to take a ride on another ship heading in that direction, and Apsan decides to walk his way back to the capital, as there are a few things that he wants to do now that he's on this part of the continent. The two friends say their goodbyes and part ways. The first thing that Apsan wants to do is visit the inventor of the Far-Seer, which Kinir had mentioned earlier in the story that she lived in one of the provinces nearby from their current position. Kinir gives him the directions, and Apsan spends the next few days traveling to meet Wab Navato, who not only invented the Far-Seer but also used it to study the stars and the planets as well. She's also an academic who's only a couple of kilodays older than Apsan. Apsan tells her about all of the discoveries he made during his voyage, and she tells him some of the few things she learned about some of these planets. More specifically, the rings that are formed around some of them, which she managed to look at through the Far-Seer. These rings are visible, yet they're transparent at the same time. The only explanation they could come up with was that the rings had to have been made up of space debris that orbits around the planet. But where did this debris come from? It's at that point the two make a disturbing discovery. The debris that make up the rings that surround those certain planets were once moons. As a moon orbits around these kinds of planets, they slowly but surely get closer and closer to it, which causes it to crumble and break apart, and it continues orbiting around said planet in pieces, forming the rings. This leads them to realize that their moon is the closest moon to the planet that's believed to be the face of God, and that it was only a matter of time before their own home would break apart and become a ring for it. Of course, this wouldn't happen for many generations, but the idea that the Quintaglio race would eventually come to a sudden end is one that doesn't sit right with either of these two. But because this exchange in knowledge ends up being more of an intimate moment between Apsan and Navato, the two end up doing the sex lakes. Okay, I had to make the joke at least once, it was too funny not to, alright? We're done here. But seriously, they do end up having intercourse. Trust me, this ends up being very important to the plot for the rest of the series. Damn, Apsan, are you a Triceratops? Cause you sure are horny. The next day, Apsan prepares to leave to continue his journey to the capital, but before he goes, Navato gives him one of her Far-Seers. With this, he continues on towards the capital, but before he gets there, he ends up making one more stop to visit his hometown, Pakkarno, where he makes another disturbing discovery. He decides to visit the public nursery, or the creche that Pakkarno has, and witnesses one of the Kohlings for the first time. He sees the blood priest eating the babies alive, and when he tries to intervene, he's pulled away by one of the creche mothers, who tell him that the reality of the situation is that not all of these babies can be alive. If they were, the Quintaglio population would be out of control, and there's only so much space and resources to work with. So their only choice is to select the fastest and strongest of each clutch, so that at least they can get rid of the ones that won't keep the Quintaglio race formidable. Upon learning this makes Apsan wonder about Daibo, the physically unfit Quintaglio who's also not the smartest one either. Apsan wonders if Daibo was really the best one out of his clutch to live, and then wonders if his pack had to go through the Kohling at all. Seeing how Daibo's mother, Empress Len Lens, had empirical power, maybe she was spared from having her children go through the process of the Kohling. Eventually, Apsan continues on his way back to the capital, and does so by joining a hunting pack of Quintaglios from Pakkarno, who goes towards that direction on running beasts. Here, Apsan joins them on a brief hunt where he makes yet another notable kill, this time being a Fang Jaw, which is a completely fictional quadrupedal theropod dinosaur with two large teeth protruding from its top jaw. And because it's not the easiest thing to kill, the hunting group commend Apsan for making such a kill despite being an amateur. As Apsan continues his journey, one of the things he's worried about when he returns home is confronting Salid about his discoveries. Salid, as well as pretty much everyone else in their world, seem pretty set in their belief about the universe. So the idea of introducing new information that contradicts all of that didn't sit right with Apsan. But with their world at stake, he knew that it had to be done. He finally returns to the capital only to find out that Salid is very sick. Afsan goes to visit him, where he learns that Salid is dying, but decides to tell him about his discoveries anyways. To Afsan's surprise, Salid tells him that he already knew about the truth of their world. All this time, Salid had known that the face of God wasn't actually the face of God and was actually a planet, among other things that Afsan thought he had been the first to discover, even using the Far-Seer to help him with it, despite what he said about it in the beginning of the book. As it turns out, Salid had kept the truth a secret because by the time he had found out about everything, he was simply too old to start the unavoidable fight that would come from trying to introduce all of this information to the Quintaglio race that would challenge their religion. He knew that someone younger and more formidable had to take the reins for a task like this. The task to convince the Quintaglio race to listen to the truth about their world and religion. The only matter for Salid was trying to find someone who was properly qualified for the task. Specifically, someone he was sure could figure it out all on their own, as if they were the ones to initially make the discovery. Throughout the story, we hear people talk about how Salid had gone through several apprentices before Afsan, because he was not satisfied with their performances. As it turns out, he didn't think they were up to par with the kind of intelligence and critical thinking he wanted so that they would be able to make the discoveries on their own. Not until he met Afsan, of course. That whole argument with Quintaglios in the beginning was staged, because he knew curiosity would get the better of Afsan, and he would use the Far-Seer to help him make these discoveries. The last thing Salid tells Afsan before he dies is that he needs to get the Quintaglios off of this world. Afsan makes his way to the palace where Daibo and the council are. As Afsan tries to tell Daibo everything else he's learned, word about his discoveries had already made its round around the capital, making everyone, including the council, very angry at Afsan for speaking blasphemy against their religion. This causes Yonalb, the high priest from the beginning of the book, to accuse Afsan of being a demon, before Daibo puts an end to it and has Afsan temporarily imprisoned in the palace basement. So another thing about the Quintaglio race is that crime is apparently so uncommon that they don't seem to have any kind of punishment at the ready for situations like this. So until they decide what they're going to do for Afsan, he'll simply be locked up for now. During this period, Kadul, the butcher from the beginning of the book, stops by with food. He uses this as an excuse to talk to Afsan about why people like Daibo would be against his newfound ideas. Because Daibo is the descendant to Larsk, the prophet who discovered the face of God, that gives Daibo the divine rights to rule with empirical power. And to discredit Larsk's discovery with Afsan's new ideas and information would also be discrediting Daibo's rights to rule. Afsan also tells Kadul that their planet is coming to an end and that they should try and find a way off of the planet for the future of the Quintaglio race. Kadul takes this information to Jal Tedex, the Quintaglio that led Afsan's first hunt. It's here we find out that she and Kadul are a part of the Lubalites cult, and they believe that Afsan is the One, the great male hunter from Lubal's final message before her death. It's also revealed that Quintaglios is a Lubalite as well, and he went off by ship to go rally all of the several other Lubalites so that they can go and help Afsan. But they would be too late to help Afsan escape his fate. Yonalb attempts to get Afsan to sign a document that basically states that he's signing to be exiled from any areas of civilization and has to live on his own in the wild with all of his blasphemous ideas. Yonalb tries to intimidate him, but ultimately Afsan refuses his offer, which greatly angers Yonalb. This would lead to a much more drastic punishment. While Daibo refuses to have Afsan killed, he does allow the removal of his eyes. Afsan is taken to the central area of the capital, where Yonalb takes an obsidian dagger and gouges out both of Afsan's eyes, leaving him permanently blind so that he can never claim to see anything that goes against their religion again. After this ordeal, Afsan is allowed to live, but is stripped of everything. He has no home, no job, nothing. For the following weeks, he's been taken care of by Kadul and Tedex, who both wait patiently for the Lubalites cult to arrive. When they do, they storm the capital and group up in the central area, where the now blind Afsan is put on a shovel mouth to talk to all of them. Afsan tells the 500 or so Lubalites of his discoveries and how the world will eventually come to an end, but that it doesn't have to mean the end of the Quintaglios. They could work together to find a way off of their planet before it crumbles to dust. His speech is interrupted by Yanalb, who leads his own army of palace guards to put a stop to the Lubalites' blasphemy. A war breaks out between the two groups, with Quintaglio going after Yanalb, who is on top of a spike frill. As the Lubalites are fighting off the palace guards, Quintaglio climbs atop the spike frill and delivers the final blow to the story's antagonist by biting his head off. As the battle rages on, it is all of a sudden disrupted by the eruption of the nearby Chamar volcanoes. This causes a huge landquake that ends up destroying a lot of the city. But Absan, Quintaglio, Tedex, and Daibo manage to escape the wreckage by boarding the Dashitor. Turns out, on top of rallying up all of the Lubalites, Kinir also made a stop to pick up Novato as well. Because during the time that Afsan had been gone, which was much longer than I first thought, Novato would deliver their children, all 8 of them that were also spared from the culling. Because word of Afsan being the one would get out to all of land, the Blood Priests would give him special permission and allow all of his children to live, much to Afsan's relief. During this time, Daibo would finally talk to Afsan, apologizing to him for everything that he had allowed to happen. He recognizes what Afsan is trying to do for the Quintaglio race and is willing to help out in any way he can to get them off of this world. Afsan has Daibo appoint Novato as the leader of this project, which will later become known as the Quintaglio Exodus Project. The story ends with our main characters going back to the capital, not only so they can start rebuilding their home, but also begin their mission in finding a new one. Fossil Hunter is the second book of the series, and has a lot more going on in it than Far-Seer. Far-Seer was solely focused on Afsan's journey around the world and the discoveries he made. But in Fossil Hunter, there are 4 main storylines that we go back and forth from throughout the book. But to make things easier, I'm just going to summarize each story individually. The events of Fossil Hunter take place 16 Kila days after the events of Far-Seer. With the new generation comes new conflicts and issues, but the efforts in the Exodus project continue. The main story is centered around Taroka, one of Afsan's children and the main protagonist of Fossil Hunter. Just like Far-Seer, Fossil Hunter is also allegorical, and Taroka is supposed to represent the Saurian version of Charles Darwin. You'll see more of this as we continue the story, but all you need to know for now is that in Fossil Hunter, he's appointed to be the leader of the geological survey team for the Quintaglio Exodus project. Basically, his job is to survey the land to see if there are any resources or materials that can be used for the Exodus project. The story begins with Taroka working around a dig site with his team, where 2 of his colleagues succumb to Dagamant and begin to attack each other. The whole point of this scene is to show that Taroka is different from the other Quintaglios. Not only is he able to break up the fight by getting close to them without succumbing to Dagamant himself, he is also able to ball his hand into a fist and punch one of them. Which you have to remember, these guys are animals that typically use their claws as their main line of defense. So for him to use a fist is a very uncommon thing amongst the Quintaglios. Later on, Taroka meets another new character that he recruits to the survey team. This character is named Babnol, and she's also different from the other Quintaglios because she has a horn at the tip of her muzzle. All Quintaglios are born with this horn to make it easier for them to break out of their eggshells, but usually lose them a few days after they hatch. Due to some mutation, Babnol kept hers even after all of these years. They travel to the dig site where Taroka was initially working, where he then discovers a strange blue orb-like tool that had been buried for a very long time. The material is very strong and unrecognizable to anything he had ever seen before, and also has 6 movable rings attached to it. Due to the estimated age of the artifact and the age of the land, this makes Taroka question the Quintaglio belief that the world was created 5,000 Kila days ago, which is another thing that I forgot to mention in the beginning. However, this information is also conflicting with more than just the Quintaglio's religion, but also their known fossil records for different species on the planet, which shows something very different. Rather than life gradually starting, it seems that the fossil records show that life had a more of an immediate start. We'll get into that later, but for now, Taroka and the rest of his team have to go on a scheduled expedition to the South Pole, being taken there on the Dashitor, which is run by none other than Val Kinir. During this voyage, Toroka tries to find out more about the blue relic and what it's supposed to be used for. It gets to the point where he obsesses over it, which worries Babnel, so she decides to sneak into Toroka's cabin, take the relic, and throw it overboard into the sea where it is lost forever. Toroka does eventually find out about this, and when he approaches Babnel about it, obviously she can't lie about it or her muzzle turns blue, so Toroka is able to conclude that it was her who did it. Of course he's angry about this, but at the same time he doesn't want to kick her off the survey team because he has a bit of a crush on her. That story doesn't really go anywhere though, so it's not that important. But basically, Babnel's excuse for doing this was that she sensed the artifact to be evil, since it had caused Toroka to be extremely obsessive over it. So for those of you unfamiliar with Sawyer, he's a self-proclaimed rationalist, at least that's what my sources say. So whenever he approaches mysticism in his novels, he sometimes makes it out to be overly unreasonable and has rationalism come out on top. I can't really say for sure if he does this with all of his books since I haven't read all of them, but it definitely shows here in this part of Fossil Hunter. Because the reason why Toroka was obsessed over the artifact wasn't because it was this evil entity overtaking him, but rather because Toroka simply wanted to figure out its purpose. Anyways, once they get to the South Pole, Toroka, Babnel, and Kinir all go on land to explore the icy barren world that's seemingly only inhabited by animals called divers. The divers don't seem to be afraid of the explorers at all, indicating that they've never faced any real dangerous enemies before. Toroka wants to study them more, so he kills one of them to take back to the Dashiter, where he discovers that the divers hold many similarities to wing fingers, leading Toroka to conclude the divers are related to them but look different because of the environments they live in. And finally, the first steps to the concept of evolution in the Quintaglio world would be made. And this is important because it makes Toroka realize that the Quintaglio race wasn't actually created, but was also a result of evolution as well. As to what, he doesn't fully know yet. Once they get back to land, Toroka attempts to search for another blue artifact at the dig site. With how strong it was, it's thought to be able to withstand a strong blast. So Toroka and his team line the cliffside up with explosives to speed things up. And after they go off, Toroka is able to find something, but it's much bigger than the blue relic he first found. Instead, they uncover a large blue structure that has double doors that lead to an inside area. They go inside and they find something very strange. The remains of an otherworldly creature, one that's built very different from the Quintaglios. And it's concluded that it is some sort of alien life form. And as if things weren't strange enough, they also discover other species of animals and dinosaurs, one of them being birds, an animal that is no longer around on the Quintaglios planet. Maybe they didn't realize it at this moment, but the Quintaglios had not only discovered a ship, but also the answers about their very existence. We'll get into more of this later, but for now, this is a good place to stop and look at all of the other things that happen in the story. The next part of the story revolves around Afsan, the blind Quintaglio sage who's still considered to be the court astrologer, and was initially thought to be the one from the final message of the prophet Lubal. However, in the 16 kilodays it's been since the events of Far-Seer, most people don't see Afsan as the one anymore. This hasn't stopped or even slowed the Exodus project at all, and all of Afsan's children are still alive and well, save for one whose name was Helbark, who unfortunately died at an early age due to illness. The rest of them, Haldan, Kelboon, Toroka, Yabul, Dynax, Galpuk, and Dratud seem to be doing well. Or so Afsan thinks. After Afsan finds that one of his children, more specifically Haldan, had been murdered, he takes it upon himself to look into it and find out who did it. Mainly because he feels he has some obligation to the task since it was his daughter after all. And yeah, this might be weird, this blind astrologer is going to be the detective for this story, but Robert Sawyer also enjoyed and experimented with mystery fiction in some of his works, so he incorporated it here in Fossil Hunter. As the story continues, we also get these weird journal entry segments written by someone anonymous but is presumed to be one of Afsan's children. The reason why this can be suspected is due to the fact that the one who's writing it is writing about their siblings. And these 7 Quintaglios from Afsan's and Nevada's clutch are unique to the rest of the population due to the fact that they are the only ones who know their brothers and sisters. But the concept of that proves too much to bear with this paranoid writer, as he or she says that they felt their siblings are coming after them, so they had to get to them first. With that, it's clear their intentions are to murder their siblings. After another one of Afsan's children is killed, more specifically Yabul this time, he is able to figure some of this out and begins to suspect that Dratude is doing all of this. And Afsan does confront him about it late at night at Dratude's home while he is asleep, and with guards standing at the door so he has nowhere to go. Knowing that there's not much he can really do, Dratude does eventually admit to his crimes. And naturally, Dratude is wondering what will happen to him because murder is rare here, so there isn't any real punishments established for it. But looking at Afsan and what they did to him for simply having a different idea that contradicted everyone else's, he figured the easy way out would be from suicide. The conversation between Afsan and Dratude here is kind of disturbing, because when Dratude mentions the idea of suicide out of nowhere, Afsan doesn't really seem too bothered by it, but tells him that he would feel obligated to stop him because, Dratude's his son. And Dratude responds to this by essentially saying, yeah, you would, but not if I did it quietly, so it would be too late for you to help me. And Afsan literally suggests that poison would do the trick, but Dratude doesn't have any. And this is pretty much how Afsan responds to that. You don't have any poison? That's too bad. But hey, on a side note, there's a case over by the door that has documents in it that you might want to see. Oh yeah, there's also a little bottle of glass cleaner in there that's like super toxic to ingest. Just ignore that though, go ahead and check out those documents. And understanding the implications, Dratude goes over to the case, apologizes to Afsan for everything he had done, and that would be the last time the two would ever talk to each other again. And that pretty much concludes the whole murder mystery aspect of this story. The next part of the story revolves around Daibo. Daibo has been the Emperor of Land for the last 16 Days, despite the fact that they had gotten rid of the Larskian belief and made it legal to worship the original 5 hunters again. If you remember from earlier, I mentioned how Larsk is Daibo's distant ancestor who was considered a prophet after discovering the face of God, and his lineage was therefore given divine authority. But ever since Afsan had exposed that the face of God was actually a planet, Larsk is no longer seen as a prophet. And without that crutch to give Daibo the divinity within his powers, you'd think he'd no longer be able to rule, but he's managed to keep his position for this long. But that all changes when his position is threatened by one of the province governors, more specifically the governor for Edstular. This governor is named Rodlox, and he claims to be one of Daibo's siblings based on the many similarities they share. This brings back up the idea that Afsan had in Far-Seer of whether or not all of Daibo's siblings were given special treatment from the blood priests based on their mother's royal status. Rodlox brings this idea to the public, saying that instead of going through the culling to let the fastest and strongest live, the weakest of the clutch was purposely chosen to be the next emperor, so that he and his royal powers could be more easily manipulated. Rodlox says that based on the clear rules of the culling, it should be him ruling on the throne and not Daibo, since he is more physically fit and has more of a ruling mentality because he is not swayed so easily by others. Because of this, he challenges Daibo to fight him for the throne. And when the public is made aware of this information, they are not too happy about the fact that the Emperor and his siblings were given unfair special treatment from something that everyone else has to go through simply based on their royal status. And this is made worse when they remember that Daibo really doesn't have any type of divine powers anymore, since his ancestor Larsk is seen as a fraud, bringing his special treatment down even more. This anger from the public has resulted in an outcry against blood priests, to the point where they straight up just start murdering them for their association to the ones that authorized the special treatment to the future emperor. But none of this has been really confirmed, so when Daibo tries to order the arrest for the imperial blood priest, which is pretty much the one that oversees everything involving the culling, he is unable to because the imperial blood priest had run away from the chaos. So, being in this sticky situation and not knowing what else to do, Daibo goes to Afsan for help. To which Afsan then suggests a crazy and unconventional idea, but one that could actually work. Because Daibo is seen negatively in the public eye for not performing in the culling, the only way to remedy this is for him to go through the culling to prove to the public that he is in his rightful place to rule. This would mean gathering all of his siblings, which was mentioned earlier that instead of just leaving the other 7 siblings to grow up in the capital with Daibo and the Empress, they were instead sent off to be trained to be the governors for the other provinces. But even if there was a blood priest available to go through this plan with them, it wouldn't make sense because Daibo and his siblings are simply too old and strong enough to withstand a normal blood priest. So because of this obstacle, Apsan simply suggests that they need to find an appropriately larger equivalent to a normal blood priest that could perform the culling in a way that would enforce the same kind of pressure and vulnerability into Daibo and his siblings as it would for a baby Quintaglio going through a normal culling. And the only creature large enough to fit this role is a Black Death, which, as I mentioned earlier, is a kind of Tyrannosaur. Daibo presents the idea to Rodlox, who accepts, meaning Daibo has to rally up all of his other siblings to the capital. He decides to give them several hundred days to get themselves ready and to the capital to mandatorily participate in this event. During this time, Apsan helps him to prepare for this event because, if you don't remember, Daibo is a bit on the heavier side. So it's crucial that he prepares so that, he doesn't die. Apsan needs Daibo to win this because if Rodlox ends up winning, that could mean the end of the Exodus project, since Rodlox would surely put a stop to it. So he trains Daibo by putting him on a diet and having him exercise around the capital. As that's happening, efforts are also made to capture a Black Death, which would then be stored in a coliseum where the event would take place. As the days go by, the situation around the blood priests get more out of hand. Ever since the initial public outcry about the unfair blood priests and the culling, Daibo had put all of the blood priest and culling performances on hiatus, leaving all of the Quintaglio young to be left alive and increasing the population. This has only increased the already set tension within the rest of the Quintaglios, which would eventually come to a violent outcome in the form of a mass Dagamant. Seemingly out of nowhere, Apsan, who at this point was already dealing with the murders of his daughter and son, starts off the mass Dagamant by attacking one of Rodlox's associates, which leads bystanders to succumb to their own Dagamant, leading to a free-for-all street battle between Quintaglios. This is soon resolved after Kadul and Daibo ride into town on shovel mouths, leading more shovel mouths behind them to the violent crowd, so that all of the Quintaglios that are affected by the Dagamant can take out all of their uncontrollable rage on the shovel mouth herd instead of each other. It's clear that this would only be the first of many of these cases if something isn't done about the population issue. Finally, all of Daibo's siblings would make it to the capital to perform the Black Death culling. At this point, Daibo has made some noticeable progress on his physical state, looking a lot thinner and more fit than he did in the beginning of the book. The Black Death, who had been starved for several days prior to the event, is released from its cage connected to the Colosseum, and begins to kill and eat the royal siblings one by one. I'm not gonna lie, this is actually kind of fucked up. Like, none of these guys asked for this. I mean, in their heads, they just felt like they were in a great position as governors in their respective provinces, or at least I would assume they were, and not only did they find out it was all bullshit, but they are also killed for it as well. Anyways, it comes down to Rodlox, Daibo, and one other sibling. The Black Death chases after Rodlox, who then moves right to its side as it tries to snap at him. He does this several times, making the Black Death spin around in circles, making it dizzy. And right when Rodlox thinks he's tired the creature out enough, he jumps on its neck and tries to bite it. But then the Black Death literally just drops to the floor, rolls, and crushes Rodlox to death. And that's how our main protagonist goes out. The Black Death then turns its attention on Daibo, who then does something even more weird. Daibo literally bites both of his arms off at the elbows and starts roaring back at the Black Death, which makes it super confused, as I'm sure all of you are, and causes it to back up into its cage. Apparently, the reasoning behind this is that by biting his arms off, it made Daibo look like a juvenile Black Death from the perspective of the adult one, since the Black Death and Quintaglios are both Tyrannosaurs, and therefore look kind of similar. And in standing his ground like that, it makes the adult Black Death not want to risk challenging what looks to him to be a younger male version of a Black Death. Anyways, Daibo wins, and that means he's given the right to rule. And in case you forgot from earlier in the video, the Quintaglio goddess that these people believed in severed her arms for the sake of the Quintaglios' existence. And in a way, Daibo is doing the same here, severing his arms so that he could take this chance in succeeding in the culling so that he can stay in power and let the Exodus project continue so that the Quintaglio race can continue their existence. I don't think the other Quintaglios came to that realization right away, but in making this connection, it really shows how far Daibo has come as a character. Of course, this plan of severing his arms was suggested by Apsan among other things, but the fact that Daibo went through with it shows his dedication to the throne. After this whole thing, the Imperial Blood Priest is finally found and arrested, but is injured and close to death. He admits that they did indeed select their emperor to be Daibo instead of leaving it up to the Coling. But it wasn't for the reasons everybody thinks. According to the Imperial Blood Priest, it wasn't because they wanted an emperor that was easily manipulated, but rather they wanted an emperor that was open enough to listen to different ideas that could improve their civilization. The previous ruler, Empress Lend Lens, would have never greenlit the Exodus project if she was still ruling, but Daibo did. And it's because he listened to and trusted Apsan. The Imperial Blood Priest would then die, but with this information, Daibo would reinstate all of the other Blood Priests and would have to select a new Imperial one. Apsan nominates Taroka for the job because who better to naturally select the future of the Quintaglio race than the Charles Darwin of the story himself. And while all of these things were happening, Novato was in the background making strides in the Exodus project by experimenting with flight. Towards the end of the book, she managed to finish the first glider prototype that she called the Toxalid, named after Apsan's mentor from the first book. And Novato is the first to test the glider out. And it seems to work at first, but eventually fails and falls apart. But this was just the first step, and the project is considered an overall success. So there is another part of the story that I wanted to save for last. It has nothing to do with the current Quintaglio story that's happening within Fossil Hunter, but it serves as a precursor to the existence of the Quintaglio race. These segments of the book are called Musings of the Watcher, and it revolves around a leftover extraterrestrial consciousness that managed to outlive the events of a previous universe, and is able to witness the creation of this current one. How this is possible, I couldn't tell you, but the Watcher, from my understanding, is supposed to represent the closest thing to a real-life god in this universe. But there are major differences in what some may believe the Watcher can do as a powerful entity and what it can actually do as one. Whatever life had originated in this universe was not created by the Watcher and had begun on a planet that the Watcher calls the Crucible. Because of the rough conditions of this planet, the Watcher knew that life would not get very far. So using their godlike powers, the Watcher transports life to different areas of the universe through natural means. And I think that's how their powers are supposed to work. The impression I get from the Watcher's powers is that it's able to control certain aspects of the world, but is limited by natural law. So while it's not able to create life, it's able to manipulate certain parts of the world in natural ways that could lead already existing life forms down a more successful route to evolve and thrive. And one of the organisms the Watcher helped out was the Opa Binia, transporting them to a more livable planet where they would thrive on for millions of years. This would result in them evolving into a more advanced and sentient species that are called the Jijaki in the book. The Jijaki are intelligent life forms that have established a language, formed a society, mastered technology, and so on. The Watcher takes great interest in this intelligent species and even successfully communicates with them, which causes them to begin worshipping the Watcher. The Jijaki themselves are strange-looking creatures. Because their ancestors were Opa Binia, they evolved to have 6 legs, 5 luminous eyes on short stems, and a long trunk with a mouth at the end of it, along with cup-like grabbers. The Watcher has also been studying life on the Crucible, which at this point had been dominated by dinosaurs. The Watcher also notices that mammals also inhabit the Crucible and sees a potential future in both of these groups, but is fully aware that only one would truly be able to dominate. And since the dinosaurs had been ruling on the Crucible for some time now, the Watcher decides to change that. First, he has the Jijaki travel to the Crucible from their home planet, which they are able to do with blue spaceships made from strong material, where they are then ordered to capture and take certain groups of dinosaurs to another planet to thrive on. The Watcher then strikes the Crucible with a meteor, so that the lineage of non-avian dinosaurs would come to an end, and mammals can begin their journey of dominating the planet. Meanwhile, the Jajaki take the rescued dinosaur specimens and release them on a moon, where they have all of the resources needed to survive. However, the Watcher doesn't seem to trust that the dinosaurs will evolve in the way that he wants them to. So he has the Jajaki manipulate the genetic code of one of the Tyrannosaur dinosaurs known as Nanotyrannus, so that they one day become more intelligent creatures with fixed genetics. And as you may have already guessed or remembered from earlier, these Nanotyrannuses will evolve into what we know as the Quintaglio race. Earlier I had mentioned that the Quintaglio fossil records indicate a more sudden rise, rather than a gradual one. And it's because of this. Their ancestors were literally placed on this planet as already formed organisms with no evolutionary history prior to them. Back at the Jajaki's homeworld, the Jajaki become too advanced and hostile towards each other. Eventually, a war breaks out and nuclear bombs are launched, killing most of the population. One Jajaki is able to escape from the home planet on one of the blue shuttles that they use to transport the dinosaurs in, and they crash land on the moon the Quintaglios would eventually call home. This crash would unfortunately kill the last surviving Jajaki, meaning the species is now completely extinct, much to the Watcher's disappointment. But within that ship holds the answers to the Quintaglios' existence. Answers that won't be uncovered for millions of years. In the third and final book, Foreigner, we follow our characters 2 days after the events of Fossil Hunter, as they continue to travel around the world, discover new things about their race, and continue their efforts in escaping their dying planet. The story mainly revolves around Afsan, Taroka, and Novato this time around, but we're introduced to a new character named Makleb, who represents the Saurian version of another important figure in human history, Sigmund Freud. So Far-Seer focused on the discovery of the natural functions of the universe and world that contradicted religious beliefs. Fossil Hunter tackled the discovery of evolution and applying the idea of natural selection to the Quintaglio race. So Foreigner wraps everything up by covering the area of psychoanalysis, with Makleb taking the role as a therapist trying to unlock the answers as to why the Quintaglios are the way they are. The story begins with Afsan getting run over by a hornface and chariot, which seriously injures him. Man, Afsan just can't get a break, can he? First his eyes are gouged out, then 2 of his kids are murdered, and now he's been ran over and crippled. Does Sawyer just have something against him at this point? Anyways, this is important because part of Afsan's skull is crushed as a result of this accident. When he is taken to the doctor and is treated, the doctor realizes something miraculous. Afsan's eyes had been growing back, and as far as he was concerned, they were functioning just fine. Despite this, Afsan still cannot see. It's almost as if his mind refuses to let him see even though his eyes are just fine. Along with this, Afsan has also been suffering from chronic nightmares that had only been getting increasingly worse after the last couple of Kila days. This leads the doctor to believe that what Afsan is dealing with is a psychological issue, and assigns Makleb to help Afsan with his nightmare problems, because it could result in him gaining his sight again. Makleb sets up appointment times with Afsan, and she spends several days, weeks, and even months trying to get to the bottom of his issue. And this whole thing is pretty much set up similarly to your typical therapy story. Afsan has a hard time opening up at first, but does eventually step out of his comfort zone to give out some information, but also gets increasingly annoyed with the questions that are being asked by the therapist because he, as the patient, thinks it has nothing to do with anything, but in reality it's the very root of the situation. Afsan opens up about his nightmares, where he mentions that he's oftentimes being chased by a large purple wing finger. He also opens up about the time in which he first experienced the culling of the Blood Priest, which according to him was back when he had visited Pac Carno in the first book during his journey back to the capital after his pilgrimage. Walking in on the Blood Priest devouring the baby Quintaglios was something that stuck with Afsan, so Makleb tries to dig deeper into this, making note that Afsan's nightmares began occurring shortly after the Black Death culling event that Daibo and his siblings participated in Fossil Hunter. Makleb makes the connection between Afsan's blindness to this event. You see, Afsan had never liked the idea of the culling, yet he helped put together this event which was literally a scaled up version of one. And in a way, Afsan became a blood priest himself for being the one to suggest this plan. setting it up in a way so that the whole purpose of the event was so that 7 Quintaglios could die and 1 would be allowed to live. Sure, the Black Death may have been a substitute for the actual Blood Priest, but it was a starved animal with no other choice but to kill and eat the Quintaglios within its reach. None of that would have happened if Apsan didn't suggest it in the first place. And the reason why his mind refuses to let him see again is because, in a way, he already knew all of this through his subconscious, and would rather stay blind than to accept the idea that he had become the very thing that disturbed him the most. This angers Apsan to the point where he goes into Dagomant and almost attacks Mokleb, who is able to get away before he goes fully under. And the fact that he is so angry about this shows that he is in full denial of the idea. However, Mokleb comes back the next day to hear that, for the first time in a long time, Apsan had been able to get a full night's rest without being disturbed from his nightmares, showing that he did manage to come to accept responsibility for what he had done. However, his vision has still not returned. So, Mokleb digs deeper, asking Apsan what the earliest memory he could think of was. And after really thinking about it, it's revealed that he's able to remember his time as a baby in the nursery of his hometown before they even started the culling process for him and his siblings. This means that Apsan was only a few days old. He was also able to recall the culling itself, explaining to Mokleb that he remembers being chased by the blood priest who had been wearing a purple robe, the same purple from the large wing finger that chases him in his dreams. From this, Mokleb reaches a breakthrough that changes everything she thought she knew about Quintaglio behavior. The reason why Quintaglios are unable to really be near each other and go into a violent trance fueled by instinct when they do, is because it is a product of the trauma stored within their subconscious that they have from witnessing the culling at such a young age. This is used to explain Toroka's unique ability to be able to touch and be near others without succumbing to Dagomant, and it's implied that his siblings are like that as well, along with Daibo and his royal siblings, since they all never went through the culling either. What this tells them is that the future of the Quintaglio race is dependent on an improved system of choosing which offspring gets to live from the clutch, and doing so in a way that doesn't bring up any kind of trauma. Maybe then one day they can reach to a point where they won't have to continue the culling tradition any longer. This gets later revisited, but the story also focuses on Novato, who at this point has been working at the dig site where the large blue structure had been discovered. She and her team study the ship and the remains of the animals within it in the hopes of using any of the information they learned for their own attempts in saving their race from their dying planet. As they poke and prod around the ship, they accidentally set off an effect that causes the blue structure to form a large tower using nanotech. The tower continues to increase in height and shows no signs of stopping, even getting to heights that seem to exceed beyond the moon's atmosphere. Along with this, a small pod had also formed, which ventures down from the ground to the very top of the tower almost like an elevator. Novato and her team notice the pod seems to make a whole trip to the top of the tower and back in a specific number of days. The pod has enough room to fit 1 Quintaglio and some resources needed for the trip. So after a few tests with live animals to ensure their safety, Novato volunteers to go up with the pod to see what the top of the tower holds. After spending several days in the pod, she does manage to reach a structure at the very top of the tower, where she makes a very strange discovery. Within that structure is a room of screens, which seem to be the receiving end of some type of camera surveillance system, with each screen showing life forms from different planets. On one screen, it shows the Quintaglios back on land, the other shows a strange blob-like creature from some other planet, and another screen even features human beings, which now inhabit the planet that we know as the Crucible. But along with these screens, there are several of them that are off, implying that those planets and their inhabitants had perished. Novato also quickly learns that there is no air in space after she opens one of the entrance points of the structure to the outside, which also triggers the emergency systems to close it off, saving her from suffocation. She explores the structure more and makes a trip back down with everything that she learned from this discovery. Moving on to Taroka's part of the story, he continues to sail around the world as a geological surveyor with Kinir and Babnol, and they run into an uncharted island. On this island, they discover a whole society of creatures that look like Quintaglios, but something's different about them. They're smaller in size and are yellow instead of green. Aside from this, they look like Quintaglios, but they're still different. The Quintaglios will soon come to call these new creatures the Others, and we soon find out that the simple sight of the Others is enough to set off Dagamant to any Quintaglio, no matter how far away they are from the Other. That is, any Quintaglio besides Taroka. When Taroka and Kinir run into an Other native on the island, Kinir goes into Dagamant and kills the creature before it even has a chance to speak to them. Because of this uncanny valley-like effect that is happening between the Dagamant-affected Quintaglios and the Others, Taroka decides to venture alone in meeting with the newly discovered inhabitants. In doing this, he learns many things about the Others. They are also an advanced and sapient race of dinosaurs that have developed their own language, construct ships, buildings, and even guns. They have no signs of Dagamant, meaning they're able to get close to each other without coming down to a violent rage. And they are also able to lie. And it doesn't take long for the Others to find out that Taroka is unable to. Regardless, Taroka has maintained a friendly basis with the Others, and even takes time to learn some of their language, culture, and lifestyle, but eventually heads back to the Dashater where he studies the body of the Other that was killed earlier. He learns that there is a lack of sexual dimorphism with the Others, because despite having many male-like features, the one he was studying was pregnant with 3 eggs. This is yet another weird discovery, as Quintaglios are known to lay a clutch of 8 eggs instead of just a few. Taroka saves the eggs and eventually they do hatch, but Taroka realizes that if he even wants one of these babies to have a fair shot at being allowed to live, he has to avoid letting them be exceptions to the customs and traditions of the Quintaglios. So he proceeds to devour 2 of the 3 new Other hatchlings, essentially performing his own mini scuffed version of the culling. The baby Other that was left alive, Taroka would eventually name Taxun. And I might be missing something here, but I thought the whole cause of Dagamant was the witnessing of the siblings being devoured. Spoiler alert, Taxun doesn't grow up to have those issues. Yet I think it would be fair to assume that he witnessed his 2 other siblings being eaten alive. I suppose he's just built different. Again, maybe I'm missing something here, but that kind of left me confused when I first read it. As they are heading home on the Dashater, they end up being followed by the Others, who have sailed their own ships heading towards theirs and proceeds to board it, ignoring Taroka's warnings to not come aboard. This proves to be a fatal mistake for the Others, as the Quintaglios on the Dashater begin attacking and killing them. The Others now see the Quintaglios as a threat, and they retreat for now, but will surely return, and they will return better prepared with more ships, more weapons, and more Others. Taroka and Kinir return to land to warn Daibo about the attack, who prepares everyone he can for war. Taroka attempts to try and negotiate peace with the Others so that nobody else has to die. He decides to bring Apsan with him since the only cause for the violence towards the Others from the Quintaglios is from the mere sight of them, and since Apsan is blind, this won't be the case with him. In bringing Apsan, Taroka hopes to show the Others that there are more than just himself that want peace amongst both groups. But this plan fails. Taroka and Apsan take a small boat towards the other ships and try to talk them out of the war. After they refuse, the captain of the other ship then shoots Apsan in the chest with their primitive guns and jails both of them. However, Taroka and Apsan are able to make their escape shortly after and make their way back to land to get Apsan to the doctor. As the ships get closer and closer to land, Daibo initiates his plan of attack. At this point in the story, improvements have been made on the gliders that Novato initially created in Fossil Hunter, and several versions of these gliders have been made, and Daibo sends out all of them towards the approaching enemy ships. One by one, the Quintaglios working the gliders fly over and begin dropping hollow ceramic balls holding combustible material onto the wooden ships, which ignite on impact, sending the targets ablaze. Several of the other ships are taken down, while the crew aboard the remaining ships desperately try to take down the gliders with their far-range weapons. In the end, the others retreat and the Quintaglios win the war. Afsan's wound is treated to the best of the doctor's ability, but because he lacks the experience with the kind of weapons the others use to shoot Afsan with, the doctor is unfamiliar with a wound like this, and so decides the best option for them is to just leave the bullet inside of him. That night, while showing no signs of getting better from his wounds, it seems that Afsan's mind is finally able to come to terms with his actions, because for the first time in 18 kilodays, Afsan had finally regained his ability to see. And instead of telling his friends and family, he decides to spend his first moments of sight to look at the very thing he's longed for the last 18 kilodays: the stars and the planets. The next day, Afsan's condition worsens to the point where even he knows he doesn't have much time left. And in a bittersweet ending to Afsan's story, even though he managed to regain his sight in the last hours of his life, giving him the ability to see his children for the first and only time, and his friends for the last, he would eventually die from his wound. 2 kilodays after the war with the others, a new generation of Quintaglio children are seen running around and playing with each other, indicating the absence of Dagamant. The Quintaglios have selected a new method to continue population control that simultaneously avoids traumatizing the new generation of Quintaglio babies that in turn causes Dagamant. Instead of selecting the fastest and strongest Quintaglio baby, they are now chosen at random. And instead of choosing them after they hatch, they are chosen while still within their eggs, with one being allowed to hatch while the rest are sent off to be destroyed. This also means the culling of the blood priests have been discontinued. Toroka hopes that one day, if they find a home large enough to fit their population and more, then maybe they can discontinue the entire process of controlling their population. Along with these children is also Taksan, the other baby that Toroka is now raising as his own child. Despite teaching Taksan the Quintaglio language, Toroka also teaches him the language of the others, hoping that one day in the future, the Quintaglios can go back to the others and make peace with them. The story ends in an epilogue that takes place several hundred kilodays after the events of the overall series. The Quintaglios have managed to accomplish spaceflight, and during the rest of their history on their moon planet, they've also managed to make peace with the others. Many of their spaceships had been sent out to different planets in the hopes of searching for a new home. During this search, they managed to locate the original homeworld of their Nanotyrannus ancestors, now known as Earth, and they decide to make the journey there, hoping they can call it their new home. While they haven't made that trip quite yet, they have managed to secure both the entirety of the Quintaglio and other population within one of their much larger spaceships, which they call the Dashator. The Dashator hovers above the dying moon, where several hundred Quintaglios and others witness it finally breaking apart, with its debris orbiting around the planet that was once thought to be the face of God, forming the ring that Afsan and Novato had originally predicted. Despite being long dead at this point in time, the new and more tech-savvy generation of Quintaglios had designed a navigation system named and emulated after the astrologer that had saved them, which then directs them away from where their former home used to be and towards the stars, where their new one awaits them. I enjoyed this series a lot more than I initially thought I would. The idea of anthropomorphic dinosaurs with human-like intelligence is one that may be hard for a lot of people to wrap their heads around, and it just seems like a concept that can be so easily mishandled. But this series was executed pretty well, at least in my opinion. And yeah, it's clear the story was more focused on its fictional elements rather than the scientific ones, but that doesn't mean it's completely devoid of it. I guess I'm only saying that because there are a lot of people that watch my content that enjoy seeing works like this, but also want something a bit more grounded in reality. I can't promise that here, and I probably wouldn't recommend this to anyone who's looking for something that's not very out there, but what I can promise is genuinely good science fiction, and if you're one of those people that haven't read this book, but continued this video anyways, I'd still recommend you read it for yourself, especially if you're a huge fan of science fiction. Works like these continue to grow my appreciation for science fiction. As a kid, I grew up with such a wild and colorful imagination derived from the science fiction media I had consumed from an early age. And that in turn caused me to never really be too hyper-focused on the things that were more grounded in reality, or scientifically accurate for that matter. And this series, in a way, has kind of connected me back to that point in time when I was a kid, because this would be exactly the kind of thing that I definitely would have read and been inspired by and expanded on in my own imagination. That being said, it's not a perfect series. Story-wise, there were some flaws to it. The first half of the first book had some slow-building parts to it and was a bit predictable, but the events from the second half were a bit more unexpected and surprising, at least for me. Despite some of the more boring parts, it still has a healthy amount of adventure and excitement in it, which was really fun to read. The second book in the series was my personal favorite, although my biggest issue with it is that I wasn't very invested in the whole murder mystery parts of it. It's definitely the most forgettable part about this book, probably because it lacks mystery. As I mentioned earlier, there are journal entries from the murderer that we see throughout the book, even in the beginning, that pretty much confirm the murderer is one of the siblings, which destroys all essence of mystery to the whole murder mystery storyline. Everything else about this book is pretty great though. Foreigner kind of falls in line with Far-Seer because the beginning of the book is pretty slow and wordy, with the more interesting and adventurous parts of the story coming in more towards the second half. And it's because of this I'd say it's the weakest in the series, because even though Far-Seer was also a slow builder in some parts of the first half, the more exciting and adventurous parts were definitely distributed better around the book, whereas Foreigner takes a bit of time to get to those parts. Despite this, the whole therapy storyline definitely had some interesting moments to it, and I like that it built up to not just Afsan's issues, but also ties into the issues of the Quintaglio race as a whole. Overall, none of these books are bad. They all had their fair share of adventure, world building, and interesting allegories and ideas. And if I were to rank them from best to worst, it would go Fossil Hunter, Far-Seer, and Foreigner. But aside from my own thoughts, general audiences loved this series, and it received mainly positive reception. Although there have been a few consistent criticisms regarding the Quintaglios themselves, more specifically around their behavior and intelligence. Some say the Quintaglios act too human-like, and others don't seem to be too keen on their rapid progression of intelligence, especially compared to humans. And I myself was curious about this decision as well, to which Sawyer had answered both questions on his official website. As far as the point of the Quintaglios being too human goes, he gives a couple of different answers to this. One of them being that non-human driven science fiction stories were not an easy sell to publishers, since readers generally wanted more human characters, or at least something that offered a close alternative to human characters, so that they could identify with those characters better. So in making them more human, it met with certain marketplace recommendations, and made it so audiences could better connect with the characters within the stories. For his second reason, he states, although there are some charms to writing non-human psychology/biologies just for the sheer intellectual exercise of it, I do believe that science fiction serves a wider purpose, specifically related to providing insights into what it means to be human. I didn't want to write 3 books that were only exercises in speculative biology. Bluntly, that would have been an insufficient use of the 3 years of my life I spent producing the trilogy. People can be pretty passionate about these subjects, and after reading from the responses Sawyer's made to defend his work, it comes off as though people seem genuinely upset for some of these decisions. For the argument of the Quintaglios' rapid intelligence, Sawyer says, there's no doubt that the Quintaglios cover intellectual ground faster than humans do, and this results in a telescoping of events. I make no apologies for this. Science fiction gives us a suite of literary tools that allow us to do things that couldn't be done in mainstream fiction. Part of the fun of positing the Quintaglios was to be able to discuss the whole Age of Enlightenment as a drama involving a handful of characters and only a few years of time. I chose science fiction as the genre and the metaphor of alien life as a narrative tool, to magnify and personalize events, highlighting effects that otherwise would get lost in the vast shuffle of history. So this is kind of off topic, but I also wanted to mention this little Easter egg on his website, but I didn't really know where to put it in the video, so I'm just gonna put it in here. While I was looking through Sawyer's website, I ran into the acknowledgements page, where he thanked everyone who helped him and contributed to the series. And he caps it all off by saying, "I bow concession to them all." Which, if you don't know, this is a common phrase said throughout the trilogy. And I just thought it was kinda cool and really nice that he referenced it on his site like this to use it as a way to thank everyone that helped him. It's clear the Quintaglio Ascension Trilogy left an impact for the world of science fiction. The first two novels, Far-Seer and Fossil Hunter, would go on to earn the CompuServe Homer Award for Best Novel during the years they were published. And they've become one of, if not the most popular books Sawyer has ever made. But as of now, it feels like the series isn't talked about a lot anymore. The reason why this is could be a mixture of its uncommon premise, being overshadowed by more mainstream works, and or just the interest that initially surrounded it naturally dying down as more time passes. But there is something that I found out about Far-Seer specifically during my research for this video. According to Wikipedia, there's a film adaptation of the book that's been in the planning since 2019. It states, as of October 24th, 2019, Paramount Pictures purchased the film rights to the trilogy. Production planning is in its early stages. Alright, before you Quintaglio fans get all excited, hear me out because there is a little story here. First off, here's the thing. This is the only source I could find that says this. And I kid you not when I say that this was the only source I could find that actually says this. I tried looking everywhere for any other sites, blogs, or posts that could confirm this, and I could not find anything. It wasn't even confirmed on Sawyer's official Twitter page, which I found out quickly that he's a pretty avid user of. So I figured if this was going to be confirmed anywhere, it was probably here, right? Well, even scrolling down to the date Paramount Pictures had apparently purchased the film rights showed absolutely nothing about it. So yeah, that's kind of a weird thing to state and provide no source of information for. I was so curious about this that I even tried reaching out to Sawyer himself to see if this was true. And now I kind of feel dumb doing so, because I ended up digging around the Wikipedia article a little bit more and I found something very interesting. Upon looking at the history of edits made on the Quintaglio Ascension Trilogy Wikipedia article, I did manage to find the specific user that edited the film adaptation part of the page. And as far as I can see, that's the only part of the page they edited. I was going to try and contact them to see where they got their sources for that information, but something became very clear very quick. First of all, they don't seem to have a very large footprint when it comes to editing Wikipedia pages. In fact, they literally only edited 6 different pages all in the same day within a time frame of literally about 20 minutes. 5 out of the 6 articles are also novels and short stories, which include the Quintaglio Ascension Trilogy. And of those 5 articles on those books, this user edited 4 of them to say that film adaptations were being worked on them. And if you look at the history for 2 out of these 4 articles, you'll see that other editors of these pages literally removed this claim because there weren't any sources that confirmed this to be true for those books. So with all of this into consideration, it leads me to believe that this user that claimed these novels are getting film adaptations was just a troll getting people's hopes up for the fun of it. And if that isn't enough to convince you, I did end up getting a response from Sawyer himself, who confirms that there isn't a film adaptation planned for these books, which in turn confirms that this is nothing more than misinformation being spread for a joke or something. It would be kind of cool to see this turn into a movie, given it was handled right, but as of right now, it doesn't look like it's happening anytime soon. But yeah, aside from that, not much else is going on with this series. I can only hope that this video can maybe shed a little more light on it, because despite its flaws, I really do like this series, and I definitely see myself revisiting it in the future. Wow, this video was much longer than I initially thought it was going to be. If you made it this far into the video, thank you so much for watching it, and thank you so much for your patience, especially. I know that this video took kind of a long time to get out, but as you can see, you know, the runtime, that's part of the reason why. In truth, I started this video all the way back in mid to late February, and I've been kind of working on and off of it, but I didn't start putting my main focus onto it until later this month, and that kind of explains why there's been a lack of content this month. You know, this was something that I kind of had in my radar for a while now, because it was suggested to me, like, I don't even know how long ago, sometime last year, like late last year, it was suggested to me, and I thought it looked interesting, and when I was looking through my list of stuff that I wanted to cover in the near future, I saw that, the Quintaglio Ascension Trilogy, and I decided, you know what, I will do this, get that done, because that looks interesting. And I can only hope that this video was interesting. I hope that it inspires you guys to check out the book yourselves, because trust me, you'll get a much better experience reading the book yourselves, regardless if you watch this video or not. I have all of the links down in the description for you guys if you want to read the book on your own or listen to an audiobook of it. I have all of that linked down below, so check it out. And let me know what you think of it, because I'm genuinely curious as to what everybody else's opinion on this trilogy is. As far as future content goes, I know that a lot of you have been waiting for another episode of the Paleontology Fringe Theories Iceberg. You'll be happy to know that that is going to be the next video that I'm going to work on shortly after this one. I still wouldn't expect it anytime soon, because the Paleontology Fringe Theories episodes definitely take a long time to make, and I'm gonna be completely honest with you guys, I haven't even started on it. I haven't even started on this next episode, but I will, and I will probably release it sometime next year or something. I don't know. All this stuff takes me a long time to make. I'm sorry. I wish I could make it faster. But I know you guys are patient, and I appreciate that. Seriously, I really do. It makes it easier on me. But hopefully this will tide you over until then, because this was something I definitely put just a lot of effort in. And that's kind of the other thing that I wanted to ask you guys about. This was kind of me trying my hand at long form content, which is something that, you know, I kind of already done before, because I've done all these iceberg videos, but I kind of want to do it on these one-off videos too. So let me know, do you guys like these long form videos? Because I have other video topics that could use this style and it could work. Sometimes certain topics need a longer video to have that time to have everything about it properly explained, and there are plenty of topics that I have that I could do exactly that for. But let me know, because I'm genuinely curious. Anyways, that's pretty much all I have to say for now. Thank you guys so much for essentially watching my movie. I appreciate that. And please, have a nice day.